Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Life Science Rundown, the podcast where we discuss regulatory complexities facing the life science industry and explore innovative ways to overcome those challenges. I am your host, Nicholas Catman, President and CEO of the FDA Group. Before we get started, here's a quick word about who we are. The FDA Group is a technology and consulting firm that helps life science companies in the areas of regulatory submissions, audit projects, mock inspections, staff augmentation, and remediation. So if you're finding yourself in need, just head over to the FDAgroup.com to check us out and get in touch. So today I'm speaking with AJ Acker. Hey AJ, how are you doing today?
Good, Nicholas. How you doing?
I'm doing excellent. Thank you for joining me today.
You bet.
So before we jump into the topic, would you kindly introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm AJ Acker. I've been in the industry for about 30 years now. I've focused on basically rare diseases and have been lucky enough to get approvals all over the globe in at least the ICH regions of FDA, EMA, and PMDA, and have really been focused in the smaller to mid-sized biotech companies. And so a lot of my experience and my comments today will come from the rare disease and the biotech space.
Okay, awesome. So, what we will be talking about today is what strategies enable life science companies to navigate the complexities of global regulatory filings across the US, Europe, and Japan successfully. So, my first question is what would you say are the biggest differences in regulatory requirements between these three regions, being the US FDA, EMA in Europe, and PMDA in Japan?
Yeah, so all three major ICH regulators, of course, share the same goal of bringing safe, effective products to patients, but they operate very differently. The FDA prioritizes flexibility and speed, especially for the serious and the rare diseases. EMA applies a more structured, comparative approach, asking whether new therapies offer meaningful benefit over what's already available. And PMDA has traditionally taken a more cautious path. They require development feasibility and often Japanese data. And that approach has really protects patients, but it's also contributed to what's known as the drug lag, where patients receive medicines years after approvals from EMA and FDA. PMDA, of course, has been intentionally changing this guidance over the last 10 years or so and has increased review timelines and also has some new guidances for conditional approvals and uh, approvals without Japanese data, although these cases are quite rare still. For an example, if you look at orphan disease designations, all three regions, of course, have orphan disease designations, but the FDA is the most flexible one. They allow early decisions on designations, and you have more limited data sets.
Hmm.
MA applies a higher bar. They require potential significant benefit over existing therapies, and you have to reassess that orphan status during the approval process. And Japan uniquely requires a credible development plan just to qualify for orphan designation. What this means really is that sponsors not only need to show an unmet need, but a realistic path to approval in Japan. So you have to go and meet with them, figure out what that plan can be prior to applying for orphan designation.
Hmm.
Of course, there's also differences in clinical data requirements where FDA and EMA accept more the global clinical data sets, while Japan, even though I talked about the new guidances, they really require local Japanese data. And
Hmm.
so to determine what data is needed per region. So if I kind of had to summarize this, I think the FDA asks, does this work and can patients get it quickly? The EMA asks, is this meaningful better than what we already have?
Yeah.
MDA asks, can this truly be developed and sustained for Japanese patients?
Wow, that's interesting. Wow. So how early in the product development life cycle should companies start thinking and planning for these global submissions?
Well, as we've all heard throughout our careers and said a lot is, you got to start planning early. So
Mm.
when you prepare your phase three study actually can be common for many programs, especially if you're going through a rare disease, when you go phase one to phase three, it's happening during your phase three. But that can also cause misalignment between regulators, which can lead to a lot of rework or extra work and delayed approvals. This is especially true for Japan. So you definitely want to go early. You have reward programs for going early, so orphan designation, accelerated and conditional approval pathways. Of course, if you go early and speak to them, then you can get potential alignment there, and get on the market sooner. As an example, if you're thinking about accelerated approval by FDA, you will need to gain alignment on a surrogate endpoint, a biomarker, and then you're going to need to discuss these with EMA and PMDA to determine if that endpoint is clinically meaningful for their regions and if they believe that that can lead to an approval or conditional approval. Mm-hmm. So basically, going early is very important.
Makes sense. What unique challenges exist when companies are preparing submissions for Japan compared to the United States and Europe?
Yeah, preparing submissions for Japan presents some distinct challenges that even go beyond just the scientific data. EMA and FDA focus primarily on whether the evidence really supports approval, and PMDA also looks at that, but they also place an emphasis on how is the development program designed? Was Japan considered early, and whether the path was discussed with them prior to approval? Mm-hmm. So PMDA will specifically ask the sponsor, why was Japan included or not included in early development? And they'll take that question and really consider it as part of your submission package. In addition, as I've been alluding to, the regulatory space in Japan is changing as we speak. So Japan has historically expected clinical data from Japan or bridging data from Japan, even for rare diseases. The recent guidances have added flexibility to this. Now you may not have the need to have Japanese data, although I believe the bar is still quite high. I only know of 2 products that have actually gone through this pathway without having Japanese data. So the bar is quite high. However, there is a path there that sponsors can go and have that discussion with PMDA. In addition, I mentioned conditional approval. Conditional approval is also new in Japan, but it is there. Again, 2 products that I know of have gone through the conditional approval pathway. So the regulatory space is changing, meaning, how can you get in there as a sponsor and utilize these new guidances? Is almost going back to your last question of getting in there early and speaking with them to get that approval pathway going. Another set of challenges is just the language barrier, the having a local presence, and cultural differences in Japan. I know these challenges are more operational, but they can add months to a submission timeline if you don't plan ahead for them. So really important to understand, what those are and, how to become present in Japan, and be able to speak with PMDA effectively.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about some of those cultural and communication differences later on in the podcast. But before we do, let's talk about the ICH guidance. How does that help, and where do regional differences still create hurdles?
Yeah, the ICH has aligned scientific and technical standards across the 3 regions. And this really sets the stage for developing medicines using just a single global program. But there are definitely, and there's examples of where this works well, which is it reduces the redundant studies and bridging requirements, it standardizes all the dossier formats, and of course enables the multi-regional clinical trials. However, with that, there's definitely differences in how the data are interpreted. So just because you have, a shared platform doesn't mean that the data are going to be interpreted the same way. There's uncertainty in how much tolerability the regulator has, and that can lead to various approval decisions. You can use almost the exact same dossier and get approval from FDA, for example, but you might not get approval by EMA or PMDA, or that can just go in a circle, and you can pick whichever one of those that you would like. So it really means that, a fully ICH compliant program may face divergent regulatory questions, might have different post-marketing obligations, and the approval pathways across regions may also vary. So I guess what I'm really trying to say is that ICH enables a common scientific foundation that EMA, FDA, and PMDA can apply, but they look at that science through different regulatory lenses. So again, meeting with the regulators early and often to determine these differences in interpretation is going to be the key to gain alignment overall.
Okay, awesome. Let's talk about some of the more, most common pitfalls that arise when preparing data packages across all three regions. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think that even though you have the ICH harmonization, many programs still stumble because sponsors assume that technical alignment equals regulatory alignment.
Hmm.
And in reality, the most common pitfalls align from misaligned assumptions, late development strategy, and inconsistent storytelling across the regions.
Hmm.
In other words, treating ICH compliance as alignment in the regulatory strategy is not correct. So you need to use the guidance and then obtain the regulatory alignment within each region. And again, as previously mentioned a couple of times, you want to do this early on and make sure that your all regions are aligned with clinical endpoint. Previously, I had a pivotal program that had two different primary endpoints. We had a primary endpoint with the FDA and had a primary endpoint for EMDA. They both wanted the different primary endpoints in order to gain approval in each region. So, of course, we're not going to have a study with co-primary endpoints, but we can deal with that in the statistical analysis plan, which was different between regions. But we had to go and have those conversations with both FDA and EMA to make sure they were aligned with what our protocol was looking like. Our protocol ended up having the FDA endpoint as a primary endpoint and the EMA endpoint as the first key secondary endpoint. And
Hmm.
so, and that's how it was listed in the protocol. But we wanted to gain alignment of that because each regulator wanted a different primary endpoint.
Hmm. What role would you say local regulatory experts, affiliates, or consultants play in achieving um, successful filings globally?
The first thing I would say is don't be afraid to use local regulatory experts.
Okay.
So, I think it's very important that they do play a decisive role in bridging the gap between a globally aligned data package and a regionally specific regulatory expectations. And their value really lies in not producing more data, but really in shaping the credibility of the data, timing and interpretability of that data at the regional level. They also act as early warning systems. So they really they've been through the process many times. They should know about an early warning system during development and submission planning. So, for example, maybe they can identify where a global trial design may clash with what the regional norm may be, or when an endpoint might likely be challenged by a regulator as not being acceptable in that area. They might talk about post-marketing commitments. That might vary between regions. If you have, post-marketing, you think you're going to be aligned with post-marketing agreements with FDA, are those same ones going to be aligned with EMA
Hmm.
or FDA? And I would also like to say that don't be afraid to use ex-regulators more as advisors rather than day-to-day.
Doers.
Yep. So so that higher level strategy, you can really run things, off of them and using their expertise as an ex-regulator, they've seen a lot of ways to try to be successful. Again, going back to maybe an example of maintaining orphan designation in the EU, this can be a very good way to use an ex-regulator to see, if you have the challenge of maintaining that orphan designation and you need to determine what is going to be significant benefit over products that are out on the market already. What might work? That's a great way to use an ex-regulator rather than a day-to-day advisor.
Hmm. Awesome. This is a question I get frequently. So, how should companies prioritize or sequence submissions across these markets? So, should it be simultaneous filings or should they use a staggered approach?
Yeah, I don't know if there's a single right order of submitting FDA, EMA, PMDA. I think really the optimal strategy really depends on your asset maturity, the disease context, how robust your data is, Did you plan early enough for Japan, for example, so you can go into Japan? I think what has changed is that sequential region by region submissions, I wouldn't say are no longer the default.
Mm.
They were, but they are not anymore, especially for orphan and accelerated programs. I would say that it's more simultaneously or closely timed. FDA, EMA, and PMDA submissions probably are more becoming the norm. I know that I filed with FDA and EMA on the exact same day.
Oh, okay.
So that's something that you have to be prepared to do. Importantly, you need to make sure that you're aligned with your internal organization and your commercial team. The commercial team usually has a lot of comments here on how they want to roll out the launch, and that could also determine how you want to have your submission plans. And the other item that I would really make sure that you're ready with is that you're ready from a resource perspective.
Mm.
Filing to FDA, EMA, and PMDA very close together, you're going to end up having FDA sends responses all the time. EMA and PMDA are more structured in when their questions are coming, but it's a very big burden on the team. And you have inspections that will be coming as well. And so if you have
Mhm.
all three regions going on at the same time, just make sure you're ready from a resource perspective.
Yeah, right. Let's go back to something you were talking about earlier, which is cultural and communication differences. Um, outside of the regulations, how do those aspects of creating these regulatory filings, how does that impact the person that's responsible for doing this, and what would you say are the differences for each region?
Yeah, I think it's really important that even just early on in the development process and then throughout the development process, part of the success in the program is really building that trusting relationship with the regulators. So building that trust comes in at the very end when you are having your submission filing and you're working through questions. If you've built that relationship, they're going to take the time to work with you better. They're going to listen to you more. So I think the first thing is really making sure you build that trusting relationship with the regulators.
Mm.
And it's really not a one size fit all approach for communication. EMA is much more direct, for example, and they expect more transparency. PMDA is much less direct, especially in person.
Mm.
And so, they really want to understand the why behind decisions are made. So it's really important to understand, how the communication is expected from their side, and make sure that you're asking your questions in your briefing documents in a way that gives them a chance to answer it. And FDA, of course, is probably the most flexible in terms of communication. We have the most paths to really communicate through email or meetings as scheduled. So it's more flexible there. Um, Important other area with this is really also building trusting relationships with KOLs in the disease area. And that's because the regulators are going to go and check what you said against KOLs. And if you've built that relationship with the KOL, then also they're going to say, they should be saying similar things to what's in your briefing package anyhow. But having that same kind of tone throughout your communication approach is very important.
Mm. Great. Well, let's move on to another favorite topic, AI. What role can AI play in streamlining global submissions, preparation, and management?
Yeah, I'm actually quite excited on the potential of using AI for submissions. It's definitely emerging as, kind of this strategic enabler of global submission strategies and preparation and management of them. So, excuse me.
Hmm.
Um, its value really is not replacing the regulatory expertise, but it's really in reducing the friction between the different documents, improving consistency in documents, drafting more concise documents, and then of course just accelerating the execution across different regions. Recently, I filed to EMA and we used AI to review our clinical summary. And we wanted to make sure our clinical summary was strategically making five distinct points. And so we loaded in our clinical summary, asked if it was making this, these 5 points in a clear and concise manner. The answer came back that four of the 5 points were clear, it was backed by data, but our fifth point, it was pretty clear, but it was really backed by hypotheticals. There really wasn't data
Mm.
backing that, and so then we took that back and we added actual data to back that point. And so it really helped us because I don't think that anybody reading the document could kind of make that assessment really easily. So it really helped us. And so I think that's where AI can really come in is really honing your documents to a point that your your driving points that you want to make in each document can become more clear.
Mhm.
The other part of this is, of course, regulators are starting to use AI, and so we need to know how are they going to be using this and understanding what their tools are going to be doing so we can actually adapt as well. So I know asking questions to how we're asking our questions to the regulators is likely to be would likely change a little bit if they are using AI as the first tool that they're using to summarize a response.
Hmm. Okay. Um, People love stories. So could you share some examples of global filings that were executed well? And what do you think the audience could learn from those stories and the approaches from them?
Yeah. So a couple of pretty good examples. One of the ones I looked at was Himbla, Helimbra from Jugai and Roche Genentech. And
Hmm.
it was really a case where they were able to get approval within about 6 months across FDA, EMA, and PMDA with their initial indication. And that just really demonstrates that they put a lot of effort up front of talking to all three regulators, of having a global, pivotal, multi-regional clinical program that was going to be clearly used across each regions. It was kind of thought about upfront. Japan was part of the process, not an afterthought in that.
Mm.
So, and there was good execution, throughout the not only the submission. Sometimes these submissions are the easiest part, and really, going through the review process and the inspections can be the harder piece. And so this was a very good execution of all pieces there.
Hmm.
A
Well,
second,
oh, go
go
ahead. No, continue,
ahead.
please.
A second example that I had was Novartis's Zolgensma, and this is a rare gene therapy. And so, of course, a more complex submission package, also newer technology, so particularly hard. And it also demonstrated pretty tight sequencing, not within 6 months, but pretty close to a year. And from all three filings, and Japan was kind of squeezed in the middle of that. And it really demonstrated that the historic drug lag in Japan, they worked prospectively again in Japan, and bringing a gene therapy product to market is of course, a highly complex program that really includes a lot of CMC uh, activities that are more complex than other areas. So this was, again, a clear discussion of being prospective with all three regions.
All Thank you for sharing that. The thing that jumped out at me was the 6 months, right? So, obviously, something that we're all concerned about is managing regulatory delays and questions, especially if we're dealing with multiple agencies. So, what strategies would you give to the audience as it pertains to that?
Yeah, it's a lot of preparation that starts early on. Really delays typically happen when different regulators ask different questions from the same data. And so, and when they also have a different tolerance for uncertainty. And so, really, to be effective here, you really need early development, early communication when designing your programs, considering what regulators will ask, having that in mind as early on as when you're developing your phase three, and when you're getting your data from your pivotal program, really understanding what do we think the gaps are, what do we think the questions that the regulators will ask. Can you build any of those questions into your phase three program when you're having those conversations early on with them? So, and really just having early and repeated regulatory engagements to build that relationship, align on the critical items of the primary endpoint, safety database, post-marketing commitments, if we're talking about those types of options. But importantly, making sure you just have a plan for your questions. So make sure you have a kind of a response team with people ready to understand, plan for questions that you may have. The sponsors know the data best. So
Mm.
you should know where gaps are, where questions are, where it's really not exactly clear. Start planning for those even before you get questions, because no one's going to have a clean review process without any issues. Every program is going to have review questions and issues coming through. So just really need to plan for those even prior to getting questions, get internal alignment on trade-offs for, post-marketing burdens or commitments that you want to make. Conditional approval might come up in by with EMA or PMDA, and is that something that is going to be acceptable to the organization? So those are some strategies that I would use.
Okay, excellent. Well, everybody loves to hear about what people are thinking about in terms of the future. So grab your crystal ball and tell me, what do you see in terms of global regulatory alignment and the evolution of that, or maybe not the evolution of that over the course of the next 5 to 10 years? And what do you think companies should do in order to prepare?
Yeah, I think that over the next decade or so, I think FDA, EMA, PMDA will continue to harmonize their standards, their data formats, kind of the baseline scientific expectations. But I think the regulatory judgment and lifecycle management obligations will be distinct. I really think that the dossiers for development and approvals and lifecycle management may become a bit blurry. So when you start a dossier for, earlier and real world data, registries, long-term data follow-up, these might shift from being extra to just being part of an ongoing living dossier, where it might just be, this living dossier that you start early on, and approval might be in the middle of it, but it's just part of a living dossier, no longer just kind of submitting just for approval. I also think AI is going to continue to grow and develop and be a part of the process that we really need to work into how we are using it and how the regulators are going to be using it, and work that into our planning. So start working with it now.
Mhm. Awesome. Well, AJ, I really appreciate you taking some time to join me. This was really enlightening. I know I learned something today, and I'm sure everybody listening did as well. And for all of you, as always, if you find conversations like this valuable, please share it with a colleague or your professional network. Subscribe to get updates of new episodes at thefdagroup.com/podcast. And follow the FDA Group on LinkedIn for industry updates and cutting edge insights. If you'd like to talk about project or resource needs, just head over to thefdagroup.com to check us out, get in touch, or feel free to connect with me personally on LinkedIn. So thank you all so much for tuning in, and we will see you all in the next rundown.